In November 1330, a Hungarian royal army of 30,000 men controlled southern Wallachia. King Charles I Robert had forced the local voivode, Basarab, into submission. Terms had been dictated, tribute promised. The campaign was over. What remained was withdrawal, a 100-mile march back through the Carpathian passes before winter. It should have been a formality. Instead, the retreat became a trap that killed thousands, destroyed royal authority, and proved that survival could depend less on winning battles than on choosing when to stop moving. The king had won his war. He lost his army trying to leave it. This is a story about how terrain, fear, and collapsing discipline turned victory into entrapment, where the decision to withdraw became more lethal than any decision made during conquest. If you've come this far, subscribe, like this video, and in the comments, tell me, have you heard of Posada before today, or has this campaign been lost to the more famous disasters? Charles I, Robert had spent 2 decades consolidating Hungarian royal power. He crushed rebellious magnates, centralized revenues, and expanded influence into the Balkans. Wallachia, a newly forming principality south of the Carpathians, had resisted tributary status under its voivode, Basarab. In 1330, Charles raised an army. Chronicles suggest 30,000 men, though precision is impossible, and marched south through the mountains. Basarab's forces melted away. No pitched battle occurred. The voivode appeared in the king's camp, knelt, and pledged fealty. Hostages were exchanged. Tribute agreed upon. The Hungarian standards flew over Wallachian territory. Charles had achieved his objective without significant loss. But now the army had to leave. The Carpathian passes were narrow, forested, and controlled by populations who knew every ridge and river crossing. The Hungarian column stretched for miles. Armored cavalry, infantry levies, baggage trains, siege equipment never used, livestock, camp followers. It was not a force built for speed. It was a royal expedition designed to project dominance, and dominance required visibility, banners, ceremony, the slow procession of authority. The return route followed the same passes used during the advance. Basarab had pledged safe passage. Guides had been provided. The assumption was that submission meant cooperation. What no one calculated was how quickly fear spreads when the first arrows start falling, and there is nowhere to go but forward into tighter ground. The decision to withdraw was not debated. Winter was approaching. Supplies were finite. The campaign's purpose had been achieved. Remaining in hostile territory with no logistical base invited disaster. But the withdrawal itself required trust. Trust that Basarab's submission was genuine. Trust that the terrain would remain passable. Trust that the army's size alone would deter harassment. That trust was structural. It rested on the belief that a king who had forced submission could also enforce safe passage. The first day of the withdrawal revealed nothing. The column moved slowly, as expected. Terrain compressed the formation, but this was anticipated. Cavalry bunched up behind slower infantry. Baggage trains lagged. Discipline held. Officers managed spacing. No ambush materialized. By nightfall, the army camped in a narrow valley, fires burning along a miles-long perimeter. Sentries posted at intervals. Exhaustion was normal. Tension expected. But control remained intact. It was the second day when movement became a problem. The pass tightened. Forested slopes rose sharply on both sides, limiting visibility to a few dozen yards. The road, barely wide enough for 3 men abreast in places, forced the column into a compressed line that stretched back miles. Cavalry could not maneuver. Infantry had to march single file in sections. Baggage carts jammed at every incline. What had been a disciplined royal army on open ground became a procession of disconnected units, each unable to see what delayed the group ahead or whether the rear was keeping pace. Arrows began falling in the early afternoon. Not volleys, scattered shots from unseen positions in the trees. A horse screamed and collapsed, blocking the trail. Men shouted for the carcass to be dragged aside. Another arrow struck a levy soldier in the shoulder. He stumbled forward, then sat. No one stopped to help him. The column kept moving because stopping meant congestion, and congestion invited more attacks. Officers ordered shields raised, but the canopy made it impossible to identify targets. Archers returned fire blindly into the forest. Nothing changed. The harassment continued. Basarab had not violated his pledge openly. He had provided guides, as promised. But the guides now claimed alternate routes were blocked by landslides, forcing the army deeper into narrow terrain. Hungarian commanders had no maps, no independent knowledge of the passes. Rejecting the guides meant navigating blind. Trusting them meant accepting their chosen path. The decision was made implicitly. The column followed. By evening, the army had covered less than half the expected distance. Exhaustion compounded frustration. Men who had marched confidently 2 days prior now stumbled under the weight of armor they had not removed since the withdrawal began. Fires were lit in clearings too small to accommodate the entire force. Sentries were posted, but the forest allowed infiltration from every direction. Horses, panicked by sporadic arrow strikes, broke their tethers and scattered. Camp followers, laundresses, smiths, merchants who had trailed the army during the advance now became obstacles, clogging the narrow spaces between units and slowing any attempt to regroup. No major engagement had occurred. Losses remained light. Dozens wounded, a handful dead. But the army's cohesion had begun to fracture. Cavalry units, trained to charge in open fields, found themselves penned in by terrain and unable to deploy. Infantry formations, effective in ranked lines, were reduced to shuffling columns vulnerable from every angle. The king's banner still flew at the front, but command authority depended on visibility, and in the compressed pass, orders took hours to reach the rear. Decisions made at dawn became irrelevant by midday. A Hungarian knight, István of Transylvania, confronted one of the Wallachian guides that night. The exchange was recorded in a later chronicle, though the details are disputed. István accused the guide of leading the army into a trap. The guide insisted the route was safe but required patience. István drew his sword. The guide did not resist. He was killed in front of witnesses. The other guides vanished before morning. The army now had no local knowledge. Officers debated whether to press forward or attempt to retreat back through the pass. Turning around required space the column did not have. Advancing meant moving deeper into unknown terrain without reliable intelligence. Both options carried risk. The decision defaulted to inertia. The army continued forward because stopping felt like surrender, and no one was prepared to declare the campaign a failure after forcing Basarab's submission. Harassment intensified the next day. Arrows fell with greater frequency. Ambushes targeted baggage trains, killing drivers and scattering livestock. Supplies were abandoned when carts overturned on steep sections of trail. Wounded men, unable to keep pace, were left sitting beside the road with promises that rear units would collect them. Rear units, harassed by the same attacks, had no capacity to stop. The promises became lies no one acknowledged. Discipline had not collapsed. Orders were still followed. Ranks still formed when space allowed. But belief in the army's ability to protect its own men had eroded. Soldiers began discarding equipment to move faster. Chainmail, helmets, even weapons. Officers shouted for men to hold formation, but fear of being left behind overrode obedience. The column's pace became uneven. Front units surged forward during lulls in the attacks. Rear units, unaware of what triggered the acceleration, assumed disaster and rushed to catch up. Gaps opened. Stragglers multiplied. The king himself had not been targeted. Charles rode near the front, surrounded by his household guard, but his visibility, once a symbol of authority, now became a tactical problem. If the royal contingent moved too quickly, it abandoned the army. If it slowed to maintain cohesion, it risked entrapment. The dilemma was irresolvable. Authority required presence, but presence required vulnerability. By the fourth day, the army had traveled perhaps 30 miles. Another 70 remained. Rations were running low. The wounded outnumbered those capable of carrying them. The pass showed no sign of widening. The wounded multiplied faster than they could be carried. Men with arrows lodged in limbs or torsos were propped against trees, given water if any remained, and told the rear guard it would retrieve them. The rear guard, under constant harassment, moved too quickly to stop. By the fifth day, the trail was lined with abandoned soldiers, some conscious and pleading, others silent, waiting for death or capture. No formal decision had been made to leave them. It simply became impossible to do otherwise. A Hungarian nobleman, Denis Lakfi, attempted to organize a rear-guard action on the morning of the fifth day. He gathered roughly 200 mounted men and positioned them at a narrow point in the pass, intending to hold long enough for the slower units to gain distance. Wallachian forces, still unidentified, still operating from concealed positions, allowed the rearguard to form. Then they targeted the horses. Within minutes, a dozen animals were down, blocking the narrow trail. Lakfi's men dismounted and fought on foot, but the terrain negated any advantage armor might have provided. The Wallachians withdrew before suffering significant casualties. Lakfi's rearguard rejoined the column with nothing accomplished except further delay. The psychological toll exceeded the physical. Soldiers who had survived the harassment began to anticipate it. Every bend in the trail became a potential ambush site. Every rustle in the forest triggered panic. Men flinched at shadows. Officers shouted contradictory orders. Hold formation, move faster, stay together, spread out to reduce targets. Confusion became self-reinforcing. Units that accelerated created gaps. Units that slowed became isolated. The column fragmented not because discipline failed completely, but because no single response to the harassment proved effective. Hunger intensified the decay. Rations had been calculated for a week-long march under controlled conditions. The slower pace and constant attacks stretched the timeline beyond what supplies could support. Foraging was impossible. The forest offered little, and any soldier who stepped off the trail risked disappearing. Livestock brought for provisions had either been killed in ambushes or had bolted during attacks. Men began eating leather straps, boiled bark, anything that might delay starvation. Dehydration worsened the situation. Streams existed, but accessing them required breaking formation, and units that stopped to drink were targeted immediately. Sleep deprivation compounded every other failure. Sentries, exhausted from days of marching in armor, dozed at their posts. Wallachian infiltrators crept into the camps at night, cutting throats, scattering horses, starting small fires that spread panic without causing significant damage. The goal was not to destroy the army outright, but to prevent rest. It worked. Men slept in shifts, in full armor, weapons in hand, never for more than an hour at a time. Fatigue eroded judgment. Officers made mistakes they would not have made rested, deploying cavalry where terrain made it useless, ordering marches at night that resulted in men stumbling off cliffs, misidentifying friendly units as enemies in the dark. By the sixth day, desertion began. Not in large numbers. Most men understood that fleeing into the forest alone meant certain death, but in small clusters. A group of levy infantry from the rear guard vanished one night. Their absence was not noticed until morning. No pursuit was organized. The army could not spare men to hunt deserters when it barely had enough to defend itself. The desertions established a precedent. Survival might require abandoning the column. That realization spread faster than any order to maintain cohesion. The king's household guard remained intact, but its isolation from the rest of the army grew. Charles still issued commands, but the time required for those commands to reach distant units meant they arrived obsolete. A decision to halt for rest might take hours to communicate, by which point the front units had already moved on and the rear units were under attack. Authority became ceremonial. The king's presence guaranteed nothing except that the Wallachians knew where the richest target marched. A Hungarian chronicler, writing decades later, recorded that men began to pray for open battle. The continuous harassment, the inability to see the enemy, the slow accumulation of losses without resolution, these eroded morale more effectively than any pitched engagement could have. Soldiers understood how to fight in formation, how to hold a line, how to charge. They did not understand how to endure invisible attacks while starving, exhausted, and trapped in terrain that made every tactical doctrine learned in training irrelevant. The known horror of battle became preferable to the unknown horror of attrition. Basarab's forces had not yet committed to a decisive engagement. They harassed, delayed, and withdrew. The strategy required patience and knowledge of terrain the Hungarians lacked. Every ambush forced the column to slow. Every delay consumed supplies. Every casualty reduced the army's ability to respond. The Wallachians did not need to win a battle. They needed only to ensure the Hungarians could not escape quickly enough to survive. Fear now moved faster than orders. A shout from the rear could trigger a stampede at the front. Men abandoned equipment, not because they were fleeing, but because the weight of armor felt like a promise of death if the column had to move quickly. Shields, helmets, even swords, items that had cost months of wages, were left beside the trail. Officers stopped trying to prevent it. Survival required speed more than it required armament. The pass still had not widened. The army had covered perhaps 50 miles. 50 more remained. Charles ordered the column to consolidate. The command went out on the morning of the 7th day. All units were to compress formation, eliminate gaps, and march as a single cohesive mass. The theory was sound. Tighter formations reduced vulnerable points, made communication faster, and prevented isolated units from being picked off. The execution created disaster. Compression required the front units to slow, while rear units accelerated. But the rear units were already under the heaviest harassment. When they attempted to close the distance, they had to move through terrain littered with abandoned equipment, dead horses, and wounded men. The pace became chaotic. Infantry stumbled over corpses. Cavalry horses refused to step over bodies and had to be led around them, creating bottlenecks that negated any advantage compression might have offered. Meanwhile, the front units, ordered to halt, became stationary targets. Arrows fell into packed formations with greater effect than against dispersed groups. A single shot could wound multiple men standing shoulder to shoulder. Panic spread through the compressed ranks faster than when units were separated. Men at the edges pushed inward, seeking cover that did not exist. The center became a crush of bodies, armor grinding against armor, soldiers unable to move their arms enough to raise shields. Officers shouted for the formation to spread out again. The order contradicted the previous command, and many units never received it. Those that did interpreted it differently. Some resumed original spacing, others scattered entirely. Within hours, the column looked worse than before the consolidation attempt. Cohesion had not improved. It had shattered further. A Hungarian commander, Mihaly Krzesnecki, organized a defensive perimeter that night. He positioned infantry in a circular formation around the king's contingent, with cavalry held in reserve. Sentries were doubled. Fires were kept small to avoid signaling the camp's location. For the first time in days, the army attempted something resembling a fortified position rather than a vulnerable procession. The Wallachians attacked at dawn. They did not assault the perimeter directly. Instead, they set fires upwind in the forest. Smoke rolled into the camp, thick enough to choke and blind. Men coughed, eyes streaming, unable to see more than a few feet. The defensive perimeter collapsed as soldiers stumbled out of the smoke, gasping for air. Wallachian archers, positioned outside the smoke, shot into the disoriented mass. Szczesneki's cavalry could not deploy. Horses panicked and threw their riders or bolted into the forest. By mid-morning, the fires had burned out and the Wallachians had withdrawn. The defensive perimeter had not held. The attempt to impose structure on chaos had only demonstrated how thoroughly structure had decayed. Desertion accelerated. Small groups, sometimes 5, sometimes 20, broke away during the night. They took what little food remained and fled into the forest, gambling they could navigate to safety alone. Most did not survive. But the failures of those who fled did not deter others. Remaining with the column guaranteed slow death. Fleeing offered at least the illusion of control. The king's authority had become a formality. Charles still issued orders, but they were followed only when they aligned with what units were already doing. Officers stopped enforcing discipline because punishment risked mutiny. The hierarchy remained in name, but power had diffused downward into survival decisions made by individual soldiers and small groups. Supplies reached a critical threshold on the 8th day. What little food remained was hoarded by those strong enough to take it. Theft became common. A levy soldier was stabbed to death by a fellow infantryman over a strip of dried meat. No punishment was administered. The killer simply walked back into formation, and no one challenged him. Communication between the front and rear ceased entirely. The distance was too great, the terrain too broken, and the harassment too constant for messengers to travel safely. Both groups continued moving forward because stopping meant certain annihilation, but coordination was gone. The Hungarian army had become multiple smaller armies, each trapped in the same pass, each unaware of the other's status. Every adaptation failed because the fundamental problem was unsolvable. The army was too large for the terrain, too slow to escape harassment, and too fragmented to mount effective resistance. Movement forward guaranteed continued losses. Stopping guaranteed total destruction. Retreat was impossible. The trail behind was blocked by stragglers, abandoned equipment, and Wallachian forces who had closed off the route. The only option was to continue dying while moving forward, hoping the pass would eventually widen and the harassment would eventually stop. It did not. On the 9th day, the pass reached its narrowest point. The trail constricted to barely a cart's width, hemmed in by cliffs on one side and a steep drop on the other. The column compressed into a single file that stretched back for miles, each man able to see only the soldier directly ahead and the one behind. Visibility ended at 20 feet in either direction. Movement slowed to a crawl. This was where Basarab committed his forces. The attack did not begin with a charge or a volley. It began with the sound of trees falling. Wallachian forces had positioned themselves on the slopes above and felled timber across the path ahead. The front units halted abruptly, blocked by a barrier of logs too heavy to move quickly. Behind them, the rest of the column continued forward, unaware of the obstruction, pushing soldiers at the front into the logs with enough force to crush men against the wood. Then the rocks began to fall. Not individual stones, coordinated avalanches of boulders pushed from the ridges above. The first barrage struck the middle of the column, killing dozens instantly. Soldiers scrambled away from the cliffs, pressing toward the drop on the opposite side. Men at the edge were shoved over, screaming as they fell into ravines below. The rocks kept coming. Each cascade created new obstructions, further fracturing the column into isolated segments. Arrows followed. Wallachian archers, positioned on the heights, shot downward into the trapped formation. At this range, against targets unable to maneuver, accuracy was unnecessary. Every arrow found flesh or struck armor hard enough to stagger men toward the cliff edge. Shields were raised, but the angle of fire made them ineffective. Arrows fell nearly vertical, bypassing the limited protection angled shields could provide. The Hungarian cavalry, unable to charge uphill through forest, and unable to turn around in the narrow pass, dismounted and fought on foot. They became foot soldiers in armor designed for mounted combat, slow, exhausted, and vulnerable. Denis Lakfi, who had attempted the rearguard action days earlier, was killed during this phase. An arrow struck him in the throat while he tried to rally a group of knights. He bled out on the trail, still wearing the full plate armor that had protected him in a dozen battles, but could not save him from a shot he never saw coming. The realization spread through the column in waves. There was no escape route. The path ahead was blocked. The path behind was filled with Wallachian forces who had closed in once the army had committed to the narrow ground. The cliffs on either side were impassable. The trap had not been sprung in a single moment. It had been constructed over 9 days of incremental pressure, and only now, with the army fully committed to terrain it could not navigate or defend, did the full design become clear. Panic replaced what little discipline remained. Men threw down weapons and tried to climb the cliffs, bare-handed, only to fall or be shot mid-climb. Others attempted to force their way backward through the column, fighting their own comrades to retreat toward an exit that no longer existed. Soldiers at the front, trapped against the logs, were crushed by those pushing from behind. The column devolved into a thrashing mass of bodies, each man acting independently, no unit structure remaining, no chain of command functional. Charles himself nearly died in the chaos. His household guard attempted to cut a path forward through the log barrier. They succeeded in creating a small gap, but the effort required abandoning most of the royal baggage and leaving behind soldiers too wounded or exhausted to keep pace. The king passed through the gap with perhaps 200 men, a fraction of the household guard that had accompanied him into Wallachia. Behind him, thousands remained trapped. The Wallachians did not pursue the king's contingent. They focused on the main body, which had fragmented into isolated clusters. Each cluster was dealt with separately, surrounded, harassed with projectiles until resistance weakened, then overrun. Surrender was not systematically offered. Some Hungarian soldiers were captured and held for ransom. Most were killed where they stood or fell. By the time the attack subsided, the pass was choked with bodies, dead horses, overturned carts, and abandoned equipment. Wallachian forces looted the dead, collected weapons and armor, and withdrew. The pass itself became the monument to the disaster, a miles-long graveyard that would take weeks to clear. The survivors who reached Hungarian territory numbered perhaps a third of the original force. Estimates varied wildly. Precision was impossible. Many men were never accounted for, having deserted, died in the forest, or been captured. What was certain was that the royal army that had dominated southern Wallachia no longer existed as a coherent force. Charles survived. His escape had saved his life, but it had not saved his authority. A king who abandoned his army to save himself could not claim victory, even if his original campaign objective, forcing Basarab's submission, had been achieved. That submission now meant nothing. The army that staggered back into Hungary had no cohesion, no shared experience of triumph, no belief in the structures that had organized it. It had learned that obedience could be lethal, that authority dissolved under sufficient pressure, and that survival depended less on rank or training than on luck and the willingness to abandon others. The units that remained in the pass after the king's escape did not collapse immediately. They fragmented into survival clusters, groups of 20 to 50 men who banded together based on proximity rather than rank. A knight might command levy infantry he had never met. Foot soldiers formed circles around wounded nobles, not from loyalty, but because armored men attracted Wallachian attention, and creating a perimeter around them provided brief cover. These clusters had no communication with each other and no coordinated plan. Each group made independent decisions about whether to fight, hide, or attempt escape. Some tried to force through the log barriers, shoving aside corpses to create narrow gaps. A few succeeded, only to find more obstacles ahead. The Wallachians had prepared multiple choke points, ensuring that clearing one barrier simply led to another. Other clusters abandoned the trail and tried to climb into the forest. The slopes were steep, slick with rain, and covered in undergrowth that snagged armor. Men who gained elevation found themselves isolated, unable to see more than a few yards, and vulnerable to Wallachian forces who knew the terrain. Bodies were later found miles from the trail. Soldiers who had climbed until exhaustion stopped them, then died from exposure or wounds. A Hungarian nobleman, Thomas Széchenyi, attempted to negotiate. He gathered roughly 40 knights and approached a Wallachian position under a makeshift white banner. The Wallachians allowed him to approach. Széchenyi offered ransom for safe passage, enough to buy a fortified estate in peacetime. The Wallachian commander accepted. Széchenyi's group was escorted out under guard. Word spread through the remaining clusters. Other groups attempted similar arrangements. Some succeeded. Others were killed during the approach, their white banners ignored. The inconsistency was deliberate. By accepting some surrender offers and rejecting others, the Wallachians created uncertainty that prevented mass capitulation while extracting value from those wealthy enough to ransom themselves. The poorest soldiers had nothing to offer and were given no opportunity to negotiate. Discipline within clusters decayed as hours passed. Men who had been willing to fight lost that belief as darkness fell and no relief appeared. Arguments broke out over whether to hide or attempt escape. In some clusters, these arguments turned violent. A sergeant was beaten to death by his own men when he insisted they maintain position until dawn. The group split, half attempting a night march, half remaining in place. Neither subgroup survived intact. Starvation and thirst compounded the collapse. Men who had gone days without adequate food or water began exhibiting delirium. Some wandered away from their clusters, mumbling incoherently, and disappeared into the forest. Others became violently paranoid, accusing comrades of hoarding food or planning betrayal. In one cluster, a soldier stabbed another over a water skin that turned out to be empty. The Wallachians did not maintain constant pressure. They attacked intermittently, allowing long silences between engagements. This was more psychologically devastating than continuous assault. During silences, men convinced themselves the attacks had ended and began to relax. Then arrows would fall again, shattering brief hope and restarting the cycle of panic. Each false respite made the next attack more demoralizing. By the second night after the main ambush, the remaining clusters had stopped moving. Exhaustion had become absolute. Men lay in the mud, too tired to stand, armor still strapped on because removing it required effort they could not summon. Sentries fell asleep at their posts. No one woke them. The pretense of organized defense had been abandoned. Some clusters were overrun during the night. Wallachian forces moved through the pass systematically, eliminating groups that showed no resistance. The attacks were efficient, a brief volley to test for response, then close quarters fighting if resistance materialized. Groups that did not respond were looted but otherwise left alone. The living and the dead became difficult to distinguish in the darkness. A small number of clusters managed to escape by abandoning everything except the clothes they wore. They discarded armor, weapons, even boots, anything that slowed movement. These men crawled through the forest on hands and knees, navigating by moonlight when clouds permitted. Most became lost. Some stumbled into Wallachian camps and were killed or captured. A handful reached Hungarian territory weeks later, emaciated and barely coherent, their accounts fragmented and contradictory. By the third day, the pass was silent. The scattered survivors who remained were too few and too broken to pose any threat. Wallachian forces withdrew to fortified positions, taking their prisoners and loot. The pass was left to the dead. Thousands of bodies sprawled across miles of trail, equipment scattered, horses decomposing. Scavengers arrived within days. Wolves, crows, and local villagers stripped the corpses. Within weeks, nature reclaimed it, and only the bones remained. The clusters that survived did so not through tactical brilliance or superior discipline, but through chance. They had been in the right position when attacks came, or had chosen the right moment to flee, or had encountered Wallachian forces willing to accept ransom. Survival had become random. Rank, training, and obedience had ceased to matter. The final destruction did not come as a single climactic assault. It came as the systematic elimination of men too exhausted to resist. On the fourth day after the main ambush, Wallachian forces moved through the pass in organized sweeps, clearing sections methodically. They encountered no coordinated defense. Individual soldiers, delirious from hunger and exposure, swung weapons weakly or simply stood and waited to be killed. Some begged for water before they died. Most received none. The remnants of a noble cavalry unit, perhaps 20 men who had stayed together through loyalty or inertia, attempted a final stand near a collapsed section of cliff. They formed a circle, shields raised, waiting for an attack that would allow them to die in formation rather than alone in the mud. The Wallachians bypassed them. Hours passed. The circle remained intact, but no assault came. Eventually, the men lowered their shields, sat down, and stopped moving. Whether they died from wounds, exhaustion, or exposure is unclear. Their bodies were found days later, still arranged in their defensive formation, weapons in hand. A Hungarian foot soldier named János, one of the few survivors whose account was later recorded, described the final hours as surreal. Men walked past him without acknowledging his presence. Some talked to corpses, carrying on conversations with dead comrades. Others stripped off their clothes and wandered naked into the forest, convinced they were being pursued by demons. János himself sat beneath a tree for what he estimated was a full day, watching soldiers stumble past, too tired to stand or call out to them. He survived because a Wallachian patrol found him unconscious and decided he was too pathetic to kill. The Wallachians took their time with the final phase. There was no urgency. The Hungarian army no longer existed as a fighting force. What remained were scattered individuals in small groups incapable of organizing resistance or escape. Wallachian forces moved through the pass looting corpses, collecting weapons and identifying prisoners worth ransoming. Some Hungarians were captured while unconscious. They woke in Wallachian camps with no memory of how they had been taken. Others surrendered willingly, walking into enemy positions with hands raised, hoping for treatment as prisoners rather than execution. The distinction was inconsistent. Some were accepted, others were killed immediately. The arbitrariness suggested the Wallachians had quotas. Only so many prisoners could be managed, and once that number was reached, additional captives became liabilities. The royal standard, abandoned when Charles escaped, was recovered by Wallachian forces and later displayed in Basarab's court. Its capture had no tactical significance. The king was gone, the army destroyed, but symbolically it confirmed what the campaign's outcome had already established. Hungarian authority in Wallachia was void. Survivors who reached Hungarian territory did so alone or in pairs. They arrived weeks apart, their stories fragmented and often contradictory. Some claimed the army had been ambushed in a single devastating attack. Others described days of harassment and slow collapse. The inconsistency reflected reality. There had been no single decisive moment, no clear turning point where victory became defeat. Charles arrived in Hungary before most of his army. His early escape, necessary for his survival, became politically catastrophic. A king who abandoned his men could not claim competence, even if remaining in the pass would have meant certain death. Hungarian nobles who had lost sons, brothers, and retainers in the campaign demanded explanations. Charles had none that satisfied them. The Hungarian court attempted to control the narrative. Official chronicles described Posada as a tactical setback rather than catastrophic defeat. They emphasized the campaign's initial success, Basarab's submission, the tribute agreement, the display of royal authority. The withdrawal was framed as strategic decision, undermined by treachery, not planning failure. The thousands who died were described as victims of Wallachian deception rather than consequences of their own commanders' decisions. The soldiers who survived told different stories. In taverns and marketplaces across Hungary, veterans described the collapse, the harassment that never stopped, the orders that made no sense, the moment they realized no one was coming. These accounts contradicted the official version so thoroughly that Charles issued edicts forbidding public discussion of the campaign. The edicts were ignored. The stories spread anyway, becoming part of collective memory that no royal decree could suppress. Basarab never claimed Posada as a great victory. His chronicles described it as necessary defense that succeeded because terrain favored defenders, and the Hungarians made predictable mistakes. There was no celebration, no triumphal procession, no monument. The Wallachian perspective was practical. They had eliminated a threat, secured independence, and demonstrated that submission extracted under duress was not binding. The pass remained impassable for months. Bodies decomposed slowly in the cold mountain air. Equipment rusted. The trail became choked with debris no one had the will to clear. Eventually, a new route bypassed the worst sections, but the original path was abandoned. It became known locally as the King's Road, a bitter reference to the monarch who led 30,000 men into terrain they could not survive and then escaped while most died. For Charles, Posada marked the end of expansionist ambitions. He never campaigned south of the Carpathians again. The defeat weakened his position domestically to the point where maintaining control over Hungary itself consumed the remainder of his reign. Magnates who had lost men extracted concessions that reversed decades of centralization. The royal authority Charles had built unraveled because he could not explain why so many had died achieving an objective that lasted less than 2 weeks. The ransom negotiations stretched across years. Hungarian families paid enormous sums to retrieve sons, brothers, and fathers captured in the pass. Some prisoners were returned quickly. Others were held for years, their captors extracting payment in installments. A few were never ransomed and disappeared into Wallachian society, assimilating through marriage or necessity. Their families mourned them as dead, though rumors occasionally surfaced of Hungarian soldiers living in Wallachian villages, indistinguishable from the population that had destroyed their army. The military lessons were not learned. Future Hungarian campaigns repeated the same mistakes: oversized armies through narrow passes, inadequate intelligence, reliance on untrustworthy guides, withdrawal plans assuming cooperation from hostile populations. Each disaster was treated as unique rather than symptomatic of structural problems. The pattern persisted because acknowledging it would have required admitting Posada was not an aberration, but a predictable outcome. Wallachia's independence, secured at Posada, lasted for centuries. The principality became a buffer state between Hungary and the expanding Ottoman Empire. Basarab's strategy, avoiding open battle, using terrain to negate numerical superiority, inflicting casualties through attrition, became the model for Wallachian military doctrine. Later voivodes studied Posada not as glorious victory, but as a template for survival against larger invaders. The soldiers who died left no monuments. Their bodies were never recovered for burial. Families erected cenotaphs in local churches, commemorating men whose remains lay scattered in Wallachian forests. The scale of loss made individual mourning impossible. Too many dead, too many families destroyed, too much collective trauma to process through traditional rituals. Posada became a communal wound that never fully healed. Historians writing decades later struggled to explain the disaster. They had contradictory sources, official chronicles that minimized defeat, survivor accounts that emphasized chaos, Wallachian records that described methodical defensive operations. The inconsistencies were never resolved. Posada remained contested, not because facts were unclear, but because acknowledging the full scope. 30,000 men reduced to fewer than 10,000 through poor planning, leadership failure, and impassable terrain was politically and psychologically unbearable. What remained undisputed was the human cost. Men who had marched into Wallachia, expecting a brief campaign, died slowly in a mountain pass, abandoned by the structures meant to protect them. They starved, froze, bled out from untreatable wounds, or were killed by enemies they never saw. Their deaths were not heroic. They were the predictable outcome of decisions made by people who believed power could overcome geography and that victory in one phase guaranteed safe passage through the next. Posada was not remembered as a battle because it was not a battle. It was a collapse, organizational, psychological, physical, that occurred over days with no single moment of decisive combat. The Hungarian army did not lose a fight. It disintegrated under pressure it could not adapt to, in terrain it could not control, facing an enemy that refused to engage on terms that would have allowed Hungarian advantages to matter. The lesson, ignored then and forgotten since, was simple. Power is conditional. It exists only where it can be projected and sustained. In the Carpathian passes in November 1330, trapped in terrain that negated every advantage a royal army possessed, Hungarian power ceased to exist. What remained were 30,000 men learning that authority could not save them, that obedience had become lethal, and that survival depended on luck rather than rank or training. The pass is empty now. The bodies are gone, the equipment scavenged. But the lesson remains, inscribed not in monuments or official histories, but in the silence of families who never recovered their dead and the stories veterans told despite royal edicts forbidding them. Posada was a reminder that the decision to leave can be more dangerous than the decision to fight, and that sometimes the only choice is between dying in formation and dying alone. Thank you for watching. If this story of collapse and survival resonated with you, please subscribe and turn on notifications. I want to know, was Charles's decision to withdraw the moment he secured submission the right call, or should he have stayed in Wallachia through winter despite the risks? Let's debate in the comments below.